a little bit in a little bit of time about geopolitics. My name is Alexander Reed Ross. I teach geography at Portland State University, and I wrote a book called Against the Fascist Creep, which talks about how you get the left and the right, like joining together in an anti-imperialist struggle. Like, why is the right wing talking about anti-imperialism? Like, what the hell is that all about, right? So I wanted to read this quote from a geopolitician, self-described geopolitician, named Karl Haushofer, who became a Nazi and was one of the foremost political geographers of his time. This is in the 1930s. He's writing about the West, about specifically France, England, and the US, saying that they will vanish even sooner than the fog of deception in the Atlantic area, which the bearers of real imperialism had to launch as the rapists of nature in order to camouflage their own agreements and in order to make their mercenaries believe that Kaiser Wilhelm II's theatrical gesture. So you have this weird Nazi geopolitics that is pointing the finger at England, the US, and France as the true imperialists. Germany could never be geopolitically imperialist because it was a continental power, right? It was not a sea power that struck out in different lands. It could only expand because it was a superior civilization in their opinion. Because cultures, when they're superior, patriarchal, traditional, naturally expand because other cultures, maybe not with recognizing it, but just sort of submit to the will of the greater civilization. And this is basically the fundament of geopolitics as it was described originally by Frederick Ratzel and then elaborated on by Rudolf Kjellén and then Haushofer. His dad was actually a friend of the original theorist of geopolitics, and he used to go on walks with this guy, Ratzel. So you have from the outset of geopolitics, political geography, what have you, a kind of an interesting relationship with what would become Nazism through this understanding of imperialist sea powers as the evil ones and expansionist land powers as actually, the benevolent forwarders of civilization. And interestingly enough, Ratzel studied in Japan in 1909. And Japan was developing at that time these intricate secret societies based on the rebellions of the samurai in the 1870s against modernism and modernization. And integrated also with the Yakuza, right? Then they believed in a pan-Asian anti-imperialism. They called it anti-imperialism because they associated imperialism with England, and they thought that they had the right to forward Asian interests against the colonial powers. What they meant by that is occupying Korea, occupying Manchuria, occupying basically Southeast Asia, and exerting their will. Okay, so the Japanese anti-imperialism was it's imperial Japan, right? It's the emperor, it's blood, and but they're against imperialism per se. They use that word strictly defined by and attached to its English origins, right? So you have this Nazi anti-imperialism that emerges in the 30s and 40s, connected directly to geopolitics as such. And so in 45, with the disgrace of the Nazis and the downfall of fascism, nobody uses the term geopolitics anymore until like the 60s, basically, when you have a realist school emerging at the same time as sort of nuclear brinksmanship and all this sort of game theory stuff. But the people who really kept geopolitics alive weren't necessarily, or at least didn't identify as Westerners. They identified as Eurasianists or National Bolsheviks. Is that for me? Okay, so what they thought was NATO has occupied what is rightfully the Third Reich. And so the new, West Germany, France, the Fourth and Fifth Republics, those were artificial states that were oppressing the natural sort of patriarchal traditional cultures and they sought a unification with what they thought should become an ultra-nationalist version of the Soviet Union, stretching from Dublin to Vladivostok and the Pacific Ocean. So a massive landmass based in the continental space of, Moscow, Berlin, Paris, linked by a federation of ethno-states. And they came to identify themselves with national liberation, which was a popular trend at the time, precisely because national liberation was opposing the North Atlantic hegemony at the same time. So you get this weird crossover in the 1960s and 1970s of some fascists like sending weapons, guns to the National Liberation Front in Algeria, training with Gaddafi in Libya, sending anti-Semitic propagandists to work for the Nasser regime, and indeed in Ba'athist Syria under Hafez al-Assad, training their secret police in torture. So the Nazis, and these are Nazi war criminals, they're not just sort of new wave fascists. So the fascist movement incorporated a national liberation ideology and transplanted it back into Europe as European liberation from NATO. And this was a transatlantic phenomenon to some extent. You have groups in the United States like the American Front, which joined with British groups, National Revolution is what they call it, and then also Russian fascist groups, National Bolsheviks specifically. And in this movement, at the end of the Cold War, in the early 90s, really started to emerge in force with the Russian Federation's sort of movement to the far right, but also incorporation of old Bolshevik ideas as the rebellion against the shock doctrine that was being inflicted from the World Bank and IMF and so on and so forth. So you had this anti-capitalist, ultra-nationalist, revolutionary movement that took off in Russia, especially in 1998 with the ruble crisis, right? And so these groups are joining together against globalization, but they're sort of infiltrating anti-globalization movement structures that are typically left-wing and sort of saying, we're against globalism, yay, and bringing in these anti-Semitic, ideologies and images. And so there's a real kind of mixture by 2003 of anti-imperialist left-wing groups and national Bolshevik groups based in, Russia, Italy, France. The same networks that had been opposing NATO in the 60s and 70s, but also opposing communism, we're now flipping to the pro-Kremlin side and seeking a Kremlin-centered Eurasia from Dublin to Vladivostok. And the reason why I say that is because these are the exact terms that Putin recently used in one of his recent speeches. He said from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I guess he didn't think that we should cross the channel. But it was the same ideas that have been reincorporated now into Putin's, into the architecture of his state. And it's profoundly disturbing that we have a left-wing anti-imperialist movement that has gone so far in the direction of adhering to this effectively national Bolshevik ideology. If you look, for example, at Girardi, is that right? Giraldi. Yeah, you look at him. He wrote a racist article for the UN's Review. Now look at the UN's Review was founded by a guy from the far right, an ideologue from the far right, who also funds or has helped fund Counterpunch, which is a left-wing anti-imperialist site. So, you have this crossover, partly for want of resources, right? Like maybe they're desperate and they feel like they have to pool resources to fight liberalism. Partly because of the absolute hatred of liberalism in general, which in my opinion is a failure to understand and fully comprehend the origins of socialism itself, and a deeply conservative and self-destructive inward turn against itself. rather than a sort of process of adaptation and development in a positive direction. I think also, and this has always been the case, latent anti-Semitic, racist, misogynistic tendencies in the left end up spilling over into direct crossover with nationalists and reactionaries. And so one of the most important things is identifying these trends and networks and opposing them. And I think we've identified one right here, unfortunately. And another aspect is upholding internationalism, as the panelists have said thus far, which I'm not going to revisit, but I think has been articulately stated already. So we need to make that into a constant discussion. What is internationalism, and how can we join together against the far right?